Blood soaked through torn fabric as Elliana Moore crawled behind the trader's wagon, 6 men's cruelty carved into her broken body. When Comanche warrior Takoda found her whispering, "Don't take off my dress," he uncovered scars that would ignite a fire of vengeance. This is the story of how a shattered woman and a hardened warrior forged an unbreakable bond in blood and silence, hunting down every soul who dared to break what they thought was already destroyed. Stay with me until the end of this tale of survival and retribution. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The desert wind carried the scent of death and dust across the trading post. But it was the sound of labored breathing behind Samuel Morrison's supply wagon that made Takoda pause. The Comanche warrior had been tracking a stolen horse for 3 days following hoof prints that led him to this ramshackle outpost, where white traders sold whiskey and broken promises to anyone desperate enough to buy. Takoda's hand instinctively moved to the tomahawk at his belt as he crept around the wagon's weathered wheels. What he found there made even his battle-hardened heart skip a beat. A woman lay crumpled against the wagon's shadow, her auburn hair matted with blood and dirt. Her dress, once perhaps a pale blue, was torn and stained crimson in too many places to count. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Green as prairie grass, they held a terror so raw it seemed to reach through the gathering dusk and grab him by the throat. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Her trembling hand clutched at the remnants of her bodice. Don't take off my dress." Takoda had seen plenty of violence in his 28 years. He'd watched soldiers burn Comanche villages, seen settlers scalp children for bounty money, witnessed horrors that would break lesser men. But something about this broken woman's plea cut through all his defenses like a blade through buckskin. He knelt slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I won't hurt you," he said in careful English, though his accent made the words sound foreign even to his own ears. The woman's eyes darted over his bronze skin, the black braids hanging past his shoulders, the traditional leggings and breechcloth that marked him as Comanche. Fear flickered across her features. Not the terror of someone who expected death, but something deeper. The resignation of someone who had already died inside. You're one of them," she breathed, trying to push herself further against the wagon wheel despite having nowhere to go. "I am Takoda of the Pennateca Comanche," he replied, settling back on his heels to give her space. "And you are dying." It wasn't a question. The blood loss was severe, and infection had already begun to set in around the deeper wounds. He could smell it, that sickly sweet scent of flesh beginning to rot. Without treatment, she had maybe hours. "Good," she whispered, closing her eyes. "I want to die." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Takoda studied her more carefully, noting the defensive way she held her arms across her chest, the way she flinched when the wind moved her torn skirts. This wasn't just injury from a raid or accident. This was something deliberate, something personal. "Who did this to you?" he asked. Her eyes snapped open, blazing with a fury that seemed to surprise even her. "Men," she spat. "6 men who thought they owned me." Takoda felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. He'd heard stories from other tribes about white traders who dealt in more than goods men who bought and sold human flesh like cattle. The practice wasn't unknown among some Comanche bands either, but it had always left a bitter taste in his mouth. Where are they now? Gone. Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. Gone with their money and their satisfaction. She tried to shift position and cried out, fresh blood seeping through her dress. Takoda moved instinctively to help, but she recoiled so violently she hit her head against the wagon wheel. "Don't touch me." The words came out as a shriek that sent several crows flapping from their perches on the trading post's roof. Takoda froze, understanding flooding through him. "They didn't just hurt you," he said quietly. "They took more than blood." The woman's composure cracked, then tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "They took everything. My dignity, my spirit, my will to live. They carved their ownership into my skin like I was nothing more than livestock." The wind picked up, howling through the gap between buildings and carrying the woman's words away into the darkness. Takoda felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the burning need to hunt. Not for food or defense, but for justice, for blood. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if even her identity was something she no longer owned. "Elliana," she finally whispered. "Elliana Moore." "Elliana Moore," he repeated, letting the name settle on his tongue. "You will not die tonight. You don't understand," she said, fresh tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. "I'm broken, used up. There's nothing left worth saving." Takoda leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes intense in the fading light. "I once thought the same thing about myself. But broken things can be made whole again. Sometimes they're even stronger afterward." Before she could protest further, he stood and disappeared around the front of the wagon. Elliana heard him speaking in rapid Comanche to someone, probably the trader, followed by the sound of coins changing hands and horses stamping impatiently. When he returned, he carried a rough wool blanket and a leather water pouch. "I have purchased supplies and the use of his wagon for the night. We need to clean your wounds before the poison spreads further." "I told you not to touch me," Elliana said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had held before. "I heard you," Takoda replied, settling the blanket beside her without moving to cover her with it. "But I have buried too many friends to watch another die from stubbornness." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. There was pain there, old and deep, carved into the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders. This was a man who understood loss. "You lost someone," she said. It wasn't a question. "My sister, Elliana." The name came out rough, like it hurt to speak it. "Soldiers took her when she was 14. Found her body 3 days later in a creek bed, used and discarded like trash." Elliana felt something shift inside her chest, not healing, not yet, but recognition. "How long ago?" 5 years. But the anger burns as fresh as yesterday. They sat in silence for a long moment, two broken souls sharing the weight of their pain as darkness settled over the trading post. Finally, Elliana spoke. "The blanket," she said quietly. You can cover me with it, but over my dress. Don't." "I understand." Takoda moved with careful deliberation, spreading the blanket over her without letting his hands make contact with her body. Even this small kindness made Elliana flinch, but she didn't pull away. "The wounds need cleaning," he said gently. "The infection will kill you if it spreads." Maybe that would be better. Maybe, but that choice should be yours to make when you're thinking clearly, not fever and poison talking. Elliana studied his face in the growing darkness. There was something about this Comanche warrior that defied everything she'd been taught about his people. Where she expected brutality, she found gentleness. Where she expected demands, she found patience. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Your people and mine, we're not exactly allies." Takoda was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "Because when I found Elliana, there was no one there to help her. No one to offer even basic human kindness in her final moments." He met Elliana's eyes. "I cannot bring her back," but perhaps I can keep another sister from dying alone and forgotten." The simple honesty of his words broke something loose inside Elliana's chest. Fresh tears came, but these felt different, cleaner somehow, like they were washing away poison instead of adding to it. "I don't know if I can bear to be touched," she whispered. "Even for healing." "Then we'll find another way," Takoda said simply. "There's always another way." He retrieved his water pouch and tore strips from his own shirt, demonstrating how she could clean the wounds herself while he talked her through the process. His voice was steady and calm, an anchor in the storm of her pain and fear. "Start with the deepest cuts," he instructed. "The water is clean. I drew it from a spring this morning. Don't worry about the sting. Pain means you're still alive." As Elliana worked, wincing with each touch of cloth to torn flesh, Takoda told her about his sister. How Elliana had loved to braid flowers into her hair. How she could gentle the wildest horses with just her voice. How she dreamed of becoming a medicine woman like their grandmother. "She would have been a great healer," he said, watching Elliana tend to a particularly nasty gash on her forearm. "She had the gift for seeing what people needed, even when they didn't know themselves." "What do you think she would say about you helping me?" Elliana asked, pausing in her work to look at him. Takoda smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen from him. "She would say I'm being too careful." Elliana never had patience for half measures. Despite everything, Elliana felt her lips curve slightly. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the first hint of one she'd managed in longer than she could remember. "Tell me about before," Takoda said, as she resumed cleaning her wounds. "Before the men who hurt you. What was your life like?" "I was a teacher." Elliana said the words feeling strange in her mouth. "In a little town called Cedar Ridge, about 2 days' ride north of here. I taught children their letters and numbers, helped them learn to read. Children's laughter must have filled your days." It did. For a moment, her voice carried a hint of the woman she'd been before. "There was this one little girl, Sarah, who could barely speak above a whisper when she first came to me. By the end of the term, she was reading stories aloud to the whole class." "What happened? How did you end up here?" The light in her eyes dimmed again. "Harrow." She said the name tasting like poison. "Marcus Harrow. He came through town with his men claiming to be horse traders, but they were looking for something else." "Women," Takoda said grimly. "Young women specifically. Ones without family to miss them, or men to protect them." Elliana's hands began to shake as she spoke. "I fit their requirements perfectly. 23 years old, unmarried, living alone. The school board thought a woman teacher was a scandalous enough idea without giving me a husband to complicate matters. They took you from your home. Worse, they convinced the town I was a whore corrupting their children. Harrow's men spread rumors, planted evidence in my rooms. By the time they offered to escort me safely out of town, even my students' parents were demanding my removal." Takoda felt his jaw clench. The calculated cruelty of it was somehow worse than simple violence. "So you went with them willingly?" "I thought I was getting passage to the next town over. Instead, they took me to their camp and—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. "How long?" 3 weeks. Her voice had gone hollow again. 21 days of being passed around like a bottle of whiskey. They kept me chained in a wagon, told me I belonged to them, now that I'd better get used to my new life, because no decent man would ever want damaged goods. The matter-of-fact way she recited the horrors made Takoda's blood burn hotter than any battle rage he'd ever felt. This wasn't the wild violence of warfare. This was deliberate, methodical destruction of a human spirit. "How did you escape?" "I didn't escape. They dumped me." Elliana laughed bitterly. Apparently I'd gotten too troublesome. Started fighting back too much. Harrow said I was more effort than I was worth and left me behind the trader's wagon like garbage. When? This morning, maybe yesterday. Time gets confused when you're dying. Takoda calculated quickly. The men couldn't have gotten far, especially if they were traveling with wagons and possibly other captives, if he moved fast and hard. You're thinking about hunting them, Elliana said, watching his face. Don't. They're too many, too well armed. They'll kill you. Perhaps. But they will not live to do this to another woman. You don't owe me vengeance. You don't even know me. Takoda looked at her steadily. I know enough. I know you fought back when it would have been easier to surrender. I know you're strong enough to clean your own wounds, even when your hands shake with pain. I know you think about other women who might suffer rather than wallowing in your own hurt. I'm not strong, Elliana protested. I'm broken. Ruined. You're alive, Takoda countered. After 3 weeks of hell, you're still breathing, still thinking, still feeling. That's not weakness, that's the strongest thing I've ever seen. As if summoned by his words, voices drifted from the trading post's main building. Rough laughter and the clink of bottles suggested the evening's drinking was well underway. The sounds made Elliana shrink further into the blanket. We should move, Takoda said quietly. Too many ears here, too many men who might be interested in a wounded woman. Where? I have a cabin about an hour's ride from here, hidden in a box canyon. You'll be safe there while you heal. Elliana's eyes went wide with panic. I can't go somewhere isolated with a man, even you. I just can't. Takoda nodded understanding. Then we'll make it your choice every step of the way. I'll build you a shelter outside the cabin if that makes you feel safer. I'll sleep under the stars. Whatever you need. Why? The question burst out of her like a sob. Why would you do all this for a stranger? Because, Takoda said simply, 5 years ago my sister needed someone to help her, and no one was there. I can't change that. But I can change this. The honesty in his voice was like a balm on Elliana's wounded spirit. For the first time since her ordeal began, she felt something other than fear or despair. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was possibility. If I come with you, she said carefully, it's not because I trust you. It's because I'm too weak to survive alone. I understand. And if I decide to leave, you'll let me go. No questions, no arguments. You have my word. Elliana studied his face in the starlight, searching for any hint of deception. All she saw was patient sincerity and an old familiar pain that matched her own. All right, she whispered. But I ride in back of the wagon, not beside you. And if you try to touch me, I won't. Takoda rose smoothly to his feet. I'll get my horse and hitch her to the wagon. Can you make it to the wagon bed on your own? It was another small kindness, letting her maintain the illusion of control of choice. Elliana nodded and began the painful process of getting to her feet. Every movement sent fire through her abused body, but she gritted her teeth and persevered. By the time Takoda returned with his paint mare, Elliana had managed to climb into the wagon bed and arrange herself as comfortably as possible among the supplies. The blanket was wrapped tightly around her like armor. Ready? He asked without looking back at her. No, she said honestly, but I don't think I'll ever be ready for anything again. That's all right, Takoda said, clicking to his horse. Sometimes we just have to move forward anyway, and hope readiness catches up. As the wagon lurched into motion, leaving the trading post's false light behind, Elliana stared up at the vast canopy of stars. For 3 weeks, she'd seen only the inside of a canvas-covered wagon, or the leering faces of her captors. The open sky felt both liberating and terrifying. "Takoda," she called softly. "Yes. What if I never heal? What if this is all I am now, broken and afraid?" The warrior was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and his horse's steady breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Then you'll be broken and afraid in a safe place with someone who understands. And maybe that will be enough to start with." As they rolled deeper into the desert night, Elliana closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to not be afraid. The memory was distant, like something glimpsed through water, but it was there. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she might find her way back to it. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent to human suffering, but somehow their presence felt less lonely now. In the darkness ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. And sitting on the wagon seat ahead of her was a man who had chosen kindness when he could have chosen indifference. A man who understood that sometimes healing began not with grand gestures, but with the simple act of refusing to let someone die alone. Behind them, the trading post's lights faded to nothing, taking with them the last traces of the woman Elliana Moore had been. What lay ahead remained to be written. But for the first time since her nightmare began, she was the one holding the pen. The canyon walls rose like ancient guardians around them as Takoda's wagon wound its way through the narrow passage that led to his hidden refuge. Dawn was still hours away, but the darkness felt different here, protective rather than threatening. Elliana had dozed fitfully during the journey, jerking awake every time the wagon hit a rut or stone, her body instinctively preparing for violence that never came. "Almost there," Takoda said quietly, his voice carrying back to her on the cool night air. Elliana pulled the blanket tighter around herself and peered over the wagon's edge. The canyon was deeper than she'd expected, its walls carved with strange formations that looked like faces in the starlight. At the far end, tucked against a natural shelf of rock, stood a small log cabin with a stone chimney. Smoke wasn't rising from it now, but she could see the dark smudge against the cliff face where countless fires had burned. "You built this yourself?" she asked, surprised by the quality of the construction. The logs were fitted with precision, the roof showed no signs of leaking, and even in the darkness she could see that care had been taken with every detail. "My father taught me," Takoda replied, guiding his mare toward the cabin. "He said a man who couldn't build his own shelter would always be at the mercy of others." As they drew closer, Elliana could make out more details. A small corral held 2 other horses, both painted like Takoda's mare, their coats gleaming in the starlight. A well-tended garden plot lay dormant beside the cabin, waiting for spring planting. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a home. Takoda brought the wagon to a stop beside the front porch and set the brake. "I'm going to unhitch Elliana," he said, patting his mare's neck. "Take your time getting down. There's no rush." Elliana noticed that he'd named his horse after his sister, and something about that detail made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She watched as he moved around the wagon with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and sure. When he disappeared into the corral with his mare, she finally allowed herself to climb down from the wagon bed. Her legs nearly buckled the moment her feet touched the ground. 3 weeks of captivity followed by the wagon ride had left her muscles weak and cramping. She grabbed the wagon's side to steady herself, breathing hard from the simple effort of standing. "The cabin has a bed," Takoda said, appearing beside her so quietly, she jumped. "But if you prefer, I can set up a lean-to against the canyon wall. Give you your own space." Elliana looked at the cabin's dark windows and felt her throat constrict. The thought of being inside any enclosed space with a man, even this one, made her skin crawl with remembered terror. "The lean-to," she said quickly. If that's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all." Takoda disappeared into the cabin and emerged moments later with an armload of supplies, canvas rope blankets, and what looked like camping gear. "I'll have it set up in no time." True to his word, he had a serviceable shelter erected against a protected alcove in the canyon wall within the hour. It was open on one side but would provide protection from wind and rain while still allowing Elliana to see anyone approaching. He'd even thought to position it so she had a clear view of both the cabin and the canyon entrance. "There's a creek about 50 yards that way," he said, pointing deeper into the canyon. "The water's good for drinking and washing. I'll show you the path in the morning." Elliana nodded, still clutching the blanket around herself like armor. Now that they'd stopped moving, exhaustion was hitting her in waves. Every part of her body ached, and the wounds she'd cleaned earlier were beginning to throb with renewed intensity. "You need food," Takoda observed, studying her pale face. "When did you last eat?" "I don't remember," she admitted. "They gave us scraps sometimes, but I'll fix something simple. Broth and bread. Easy on the stomach." Before she could protest that she wasn't hungry, though her stomach was gnawing at itself with emptiness, he disappeared into the cabin again. Soon the scent of cooking food drifted from the open door, making her realize just how desperately her body needed sustenance. Takoda returned with a steaming bowl and a chunk of bread wrapped in a clean cloth. He set them on a flat rock near the lean-to's entrance well within her reach, but far enough away that he wouldn't accidentally brush against her. "Rabbit stew," he said. "My grandmother's recipe. She always said it could bring the dead back to life." Elliana's hands shook as she reached for the bowl, and she had to set it down quickly to keep from spilling the precious broth. The simple act of holding something warm and nourishing was almost overwhelming. "Take your time," Takoda said gently. "Your body needs to remember how to process food again." He was right. The first few sips of broth hit her empty stomach like fire, making her double over with cramping. But gradually her system began to accept the nourishment. The warmth spread through her chest and belly, chasing away some of the bone-deep cold that had settled into her during those 3 weeks of hell. "Better?" Takoda asked after she'd managed half the bowl. "Yes, thank you." The words felt inadequate for everything he'd already done, but they were all she had. "Get some rest. We'll talk more when you're stronger." But as Takoda turned to go, Elliana found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "Wait." He paused, looking back at her with patient eyes. "Why did you really help me? And don't say it's because of your sister. There's something else." For a long moment, Takoda stood silently in the starlight, and Elliana thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. 2 years ago, I went to a trading post, much like the one where I found you. There was a Kiowa woman there, beaten nearly to death by 3 trappers who thought her life was worth less than their entertainment. He paused, his jaw working silently. I walked away. Told myself it wasn't my business, that getting involved would only bring trouble to my people. What happened to her? She died that night. Alone. The words came out flat and hard. I learned later that she was pregnant. The child died with her. Elliana felt something twist in her chest, not pity, but recognition. You blame yourself. I told myself I was being practical. Wise. But wisdom that allows evil to flourish isn't wisdom at all. It's cowardice. He met her eyes directly. I won't make that mistake again. The honesty of his confession hung between them like a bridge. Here was a man who understood the weight of regret, who had chosen to act differently when given a second chance. I don't know how to be around men anymore, Elliana said quietly. even you, especially at night. Everything in me screams to run when you get too close. Then we'll take it slow, one day at a time, one conversation at a time. What if I never get better? What if the fear never goes away? Takoda considered this seriously, as if her question deserved his full attention rather than empty reassurance. Then you'll live with the fear, but you'll still be living, and that's what matters. Fear is something you carry, not something that carries you unless you let it. His words sparked something in Elliana's chest, not hope, not yet, but a kind of stubborn defiance. She had survived 3 weeks of unimaginable horror. She had cleaned her own wounds, climbed into this wagon, made the choice to come here rather than die behind that trading post. Maybe that was enough to build on. "Tell me about them," she said suddenly. "Who? The men who took me? You're planning to hunt them, aren't you?" Takoda's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tension that ran through his shoulders. "What makes you think that?" "The way you asked about them at the trading post. The way you've been calculating distances and timing since we left. You're a warrior. I can see it in how you move, how you watch everything around us. Men like Harrow don't just disappear into your world without consequences." "They hurt you," Takoda said simply. "They'll hurt others. That's reason enough. They're dangerous. More dangerous than you might think." Elliana set down her bowl and pulled the blanket closer. "Harrow isn't just some opportunistic slave trader. He's organized, connected. He has men in towns throughout the territory, people who help him identify targets and cover his tracks." "How do you know this?" "I listened. Even when they thought I was broken, I listened. Harrow likes to brag about his network, about how he's got judges and sheriffs in his pocket. He's been doing this for years, maybe decades." Takoda absorbed this information without visible reaction, but Elliana could sense the wheels turning behind his dark eyes. "What else did you learn?" "He has a base camp somewhere in the Guadalupe Mountains, a whole compound where he breaks in new girls before selling them off. The men were talking about taking me there after." She couldn't finish the sentence, but she pushed forward. "That's where he'll take the next ones." "Next ones?" "There are always next ones with men like Harrow. I wasn't his first victim, and I won't be his last unless someone stops him." The implication hung heavy between them. Takoda had the skills to hunt these men down, but doing so would mean leaving Elliana alone and vulnerable. It was an impossible choice: save one woman or potentially save many. "You're thinking you have to choose," Elliana said, reading his expression with surprising accuracy. "Between helping me heal and stopping them from hurting others." The thought had occurred to me. "What if there was another way?" Takoda looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Elliana took a shaky breath, the words forming in her mind even as she spoke them. "What if I came with you?" "Absolutely not." The response was immediate and firm. "You're in no condition to—" "I'm the only one who can identify all of them," Elliana interrupted. "I know their faces, their names, their habits. I know how they think, how they operate. You could track them for months and never find their main camp without that knowledge. It's too dangerous. You're barely strong enough to sit up, let alone, I'll get stronger." There was steel in her voice now, a core of determination that surprised them both. "Give me a few weeks to heal, teach me to defend myself, and I'll be ready." "Why?" Takoda asked quietly. "Why would you want to put yourself through that? Haven't you suffered enough?" Elliana was quiet for a long time, staring out at the star-filled sky above the canyon walls. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. "Because I keep thinking about that Kiowa woman you mentioned. About how she died alone and afraid, carrying a child who never got to live." She met his eyes. There are other women in Harrow's camps right now going through what I went through. Maybe worse. And if I do nothing, if I just hide here and try to forget, then I'm no better than the people who let it happen. Revenge won't heal your wounds. This isn't about revenge, Elliana said fiercely. This is about making sure it stops. About making sure I'm the last woman Harrow ever destroys. Takoda studied her face in the starlight, seeing something there that hadn't been present when he'd first found her behind the wagon. The broken, hopeless woman was still there, but underneath her was emerging something harder, something that refused to stay down. It won't be easy, he said finally. Learning to fight, to track, to kill when necessary. The healing alone will take months. I have time. And if we succeed, if we find Harrow and his men and put an end to their operation, what then? Elliana considered this. Then I'll decide what comes next. But at least I'll be deciding as someone who fought back instead of someone who just survived. The distinction was important, and Takoda recognized its weight. Survival was about enduring, but fighting back was about reclaiming power. It was the difference between being a victim and being a warrior. All right, he said finally, but we do this right. You heal first completely, then we train. I'll teach you everything I know about tracking, fighting, surviving in the wilderness. And when you're ready, really ready, we'll hunt them down together. Together, Elliana repeated, tasting the word. It felt foreign after weeks of absolute isolation, but not unwelcome. There's one condition, Takoda added. If at any point you change your mind, if the fear becomes too much, if you decide you want a different path, we stop. No questions, no judgment. This has to be your choice, freely made. I understand. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of their decisions settling between them like a contract written in starlight. Finally, Takoda rose to his feet. Get some rest, he said. Tomorrow we start the real work. As his footsteps faded toward the cabin, Elliana pulled the blankets around herself and settled back against the canyon wall. For the first time since her ordeal began, she felt something approaching peace. Not happiness that seemed impossibly distant, but a sense of purpose that gave meaning to her survival. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient witnesses to human suffering and resilience. Somewhere out there, Marcus Harrow and his men were sleeping soundly, confident in their power and cruelty. They had no idea that their latest victim was not just surviving, but planning. As sleep finally claimed her, Elliana's last thought was not of fear or pain, but of the women still trapped in Harrow's camps. Hold on, she whispered into the darkness. Help is coming. The canyon walls seemed to catch her words and hold them a promise echoing off ancient stone. In the cabin across the clearing, Takoda lay awake listening to the night sounds and planning their path forward. He had offered to help one broken woman heal, but somehow the mission had expanded into something much larger, something that might require them both to become more than they had ever been before. The wind sighed through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of sage and possibilities. In the morning, the real work would begin. Not just the healing of wounds, but the forging of two damaged souls into something that could face the darkness and emerge victorious. Marcus Harrow had made one crucial mistake when he'd discarded Elliana behind that wagon. He'd assumed that breaking someone meant destroying them completely. But some things, when broken, didn't crumble. They became sharp enough to cut. And now, they were sharpening themselves for war. 3 months had passed since that first night in the canyon, and the woman who emerged from the lean-to each dawn bore little resemblance to the broken creature Takoda had found behind the trader's wagon. Elliana's body had healed the worst of her scars, fading to thin white lines that she no longer tried to hide. More importantly, her spirit had begun to forge itself into something harder than steel. The morning sun caught the blade of her knife as she practiced the killing stroke Takoda had taught her, a quick upward thrust beneath the ribs that would pierce the heart before her opponent could cry out. Her movements were fluid now, economical and deadly. Gone was the trembling victim who had begged him not to remove her dress. In her place stood a woman who had learned to channel her rage into something useful. Again, Takoda called from across the clearing where he watched her practice. But this time, imagine his face. Elliana closed her eyes for a moment, summoning the memory of Marcus Harrow's cruel smile as he'd watched his men take their turns with her. When she opened them again, her green eyes blazed with cold fire. The knife moved like lightning, finding its mark in the practice dummy's chest with surgical precision. "Better," Takoda said, approaching her with the careful respect he'd learned to show her personal space. "Your anger is becoming focused. That's good unfocused rage will get you killed." "I dream about them every night," Elliana said, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "But the dreams are different now. Instead of being helpless, I'm the one hunting them." "And how does that feel?" "Right." The word came out with quiet conviction. "For the first time since this started, something feels right." Takoda nodded, understanding the sentiment completely. He'd watched her transformation over these months with a mixture of pride and concern. The healing had been remarkable, but he sometimes wondered if they were creating a weapon that might be too sharp for its own good. "I've been thinking about what you said," Elliana continued, sheathing her knife with practiced ease. "About them having a network, about Harrow being connected to judges and sheriffs." "What about it? We can't just kill them and be done with it. The network will survive, find new leadership, keep operating. We need to dismantle the whole operation." Takoda had reached the same conclusion weeks ago, but he'd been waiting for her to arrive at it on her own. "That means gathering evidence, identifying conspirators, making it impossible for them to hide behind corrupted officials. It also means we can't go in like avenging spirits. We need to be smart about this." Elliana walked to the edge of the creek and splashed cool water on her face. "I've been thinking about how to find them." "I'm listening." "Harrow's operation depends on information knowing which towns have vulnerable women, which officials can be bought, which routes are safe for moving captives. That information has to come from somewhere." "Scouts," Takoda said, following her reasoning. "Men who travel the territory gathering intelligence and identifying targets." "Exactly. And I know what one of them looks like." Elliana's voice took on a harder edge. "A man named Coleman Pike. He was the one who scouted Cedar Ridge before they came for me. Thin, nervous fellow with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. Talks too much when he's drinking." "You think he's still operating?" "I'm sure of it. Men like Pike don't change their patterns. He'll be in saloons and trading posts playing the role of a harmless drifter while he catalogs information about local women." Takoda considered this. "If we could find Pike, follow him back to Harrow, we'd have our entry point." Elliana stood, water dripping from her hands. "But it means leaving the canyon, going back out into the world." The prospect both thrilled and terrified her. These months in the canyon had been a cocoon, a safe space where she could heal and grow strong. But strength was meaningless if it was never tested. "Are you ready for that?" Takoda asked gently. "I have to be. Every day we wait is another day. Harrow ruins someone else's life." That afternoon they began planning in earnest. Takoda spread out a hand-drawn map of the territory on the cabin's rough-hewn table, marking towns and trading posts where Pike might be operating. Elliana studied the locations with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. "Here," she said, pointing to a settlement called Bitter Creek. It's the right size, big enough to have valuable targets, small enough that a stranger can gather information without arousing suspicion. And it's on the main route between El Paso and San Antonio. That's 4 days hard riding from here. Then we'd better start preparing. They spent the next week gathering supplies and refining their plan. Takoda would pose as a horse trader, a role that would give him reason to travel and ask questions. Elliana would be his Comanche wife, a fiction that would explain her sun-darkened skin and the way she stayed close to his side. The story would also account for any odd behavior on her part, as many whites expected Indian women to be submissive and silent. "I hate the deception," Elliana said as she practiced braiding her auburn hair in the Comanche style Takoda had taught her. "Pretending to be your property when I've just learned to be free." "It's just a role," Takoda assured her. "And it's one that will keep you safe while letting us gather information." "I know. It's just..." She struggled to find the words. "Sometimes I feel like I'm losing myself in all these identities. First I was a teacher, then I was Harrow's victim. Now I'm your fictional wife. When do I get to just be Elliana?" Takoda paused in his packing to look at her seriously. "You're Elliana right now. The woman who survived hell and chose to fight back. The woman who's risking everything to save others. The roles we play don't change who we are underneath. They're just tools we use to accomplish our goals." His words steadied her, reminding her of the core purpose that drove everything they were doing. She finished braiding her hair and secured it with a leather cord, transforming herself into someone who could walk through hostile territory without drawing unwanted attention. The night before they left, Elliana found herself unable to sleep. She stood at the mouth of the canyon, looking out at the vast expanse of desert and sky, trying to memorize this place that had become her sanctuary. Tomorrow they would ride back into a world where men like Harrow held power, where women like her were seen as property to be used and discarded. Second thoughts. Takoda's voice came from behind her, quiet and understanding. "1,000 of them," she admitted, "but I'm going anyway." "Why?" Elliana turned to face him, her expression resolute in the starlight. "Because 3 months ago, you gave me the choice between dying behind a wagon and fighting for something better. I chose to fight. Everything since then has just been preparation for this moment. And if we fail, if Harrow kills us both, then at least we'll die trying to do something that matters. That's more than most people can say." They rode out at dawn, their horses' hooves echoing off the canyon walls as they made their way toward the desert beyond. Elliana felt a pang of loss as their sanctuary disappeared behind them, but it was overwhelmed by a sense of purpose that burned in her chest like a forge fire. The journey to Bitter Creek took 3 days, not 4. They rode hard, camping rough and talking little. Takoda seemed to sense that Elliana needed this time to prepare herself mentally for what lay ahead. Each mile brought them closer to the world that had hurt her, and each mile required her to choose courage over fear. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they crested a ridge and saw Bitter Creek spread out below them. A collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that looked like every other frontier town Elliana had ever seen. But somewhere in those buildings might be the information they needed to find Harrow and his operation. "Remember?" Takoda said as they guided their horses down toward the settlement. "You're my wife. You defer to me in public, stay close, let me do most of the talking. It goes against everything we've been working toward, but it keeps us alive and gets us closer to our goal," Elliana finished. "I understand." They rode into Bitter Creek as the sun was setting, drawing the usual curious glances that strangers attracted in small towns. Takoda guided them directly to the saloon, a 2-story building with a crude sign that read, "The Desert Rose." If Coleman Pike was in town, that's where he'd be. "Wait here with the horses," Takoda told her as they dismounted. "I'll go inside and see what I can learn." But as he turned toward the saloon's batwing doors, Elliana caught his arm. "Takoda, wait." He looked back at her, seeing something in her expression that made him pause. "He's here," she whispered, her face going pale beneath its tan. "Pike." I can hear his voice through the doors. Takoda listened carefully and caught the sound of a man's voice, holding forth loudly about something punctuated by nervous laughter. "Are you sure? I'd know that voice anywhere. He's the one who asked all those questions about me in Cedar Ridge. He's the reason Harrow knew exactly where to find me." The moment had arrived sooner than they'd expected. All their planning, all their preparation came down to this: walking into a saloon where the man who had helped destroy Elliana's life was drinking and laughing as if he'd never committed a crime in his life. "Can you do this?" Takoda asked quietly. "Can you be in the same room with him and not give us away?" Elliana took a deep breath, feeling the knife at her belt and remembering all the hours of training that had brought her to this moment. "Yes. But Takoda, what? When the time comes to make him pay, I want to be the one holding the blade." Takoda nodded grimly. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They tied their horses to the hitching post and walked through the saloon doors together, Elliana following a half-step behind as a Comanche wife would. The interior was typical frontier saloon: rough-hewn tables, a bar made from planks laid across barrels, and the smell of unwashed bodies mixed with tobacco smoke and cheap whiskey. Pike was exactly where his voice had suggested, holding court at a corner table, regaling two local men with some story that had them chuckling and shaking their heads. He looked exactly as Elliana remembered him, thin and weaselly, with the distinctive scar running from his ear to his jaw like a permanent sneer. "2 whiskeys," Takoda told the bartender in accented English, playing his role as a Comanche who spoke the white man's language adequately, but not perfectly. As they waited for their drinks, Elliana forced herself to study Pike with clinical detachment. He was drunk, but not falling down loose enough to talk freely, but still coherent. Perfect for extracting information. "Telling you boys there's opportunity all through this territory for a man who knows how to spot it," Pike was saying to his companions. "Take this little town I was in last month, Cedar Ridge. Pretty little schoolteacher there, all alone and unprotected. Man could make a fine profit on a prize like that." Elliana's hand tightened on her whiskey glass, but she kept her expression neutral. Beside her, Takoda remained perfectly still, though she could sense the coiled tension in his body. "What kind of profit you talking about, Pike?" one of his companions asked. "The kind that pays well enough to keep a man in whiskey and women for months at a time," Pike replied with a leer. "Of course you gotta know the right people. Gotta have connections." "Connections to who?" Pike glanced around the saloon, then leaned in closer to his companions. "Let's just say there's folks in this territory who appreciate good information about valuable merchandise. Folks who pay well for quality goods delivered to the right location." It was exactly what they'd hoped to hear. Pike was actively recruiting for Harrow's network. But they needed more specific information, something that would lead them to the main operation. Takoda caught the bartender's attention. "Your friend there," he said, nodding toward Pike's table. "He sounds like a man who knows the territory well." "Pike? Oh, he's been through here before. Claims to be a horse trader, but I never seen him with any horses worth trading." "Ah," Takoda said meaningfully. "A man of many talents, perhaps." "If you say so. Personally, I think he's full of hot air and tall tales." But Elliana had heard enough. Pike wasn't just bragging, he was actively recruiting new members for Harrow's network right here in this saloon. The question was how to get close enough to learn specifics without blowing their cover. The answer came when Pike's companions excused themselves for the night, leaving him alone at his table with a half-empty bottle. This was their chance. "Go talk to him," Elliana whispered to Takoda. "Tell him you're interested in profitable opportunities. Let me listen from here." Takoda hesitated. "Are you sure you can handle hearing him talk about what they did?" "I have to. This is why we came." With a final concerned glance, Takoda approached Pike's table. "Mind if I join you, friend? My wife and I are new to this area, and you seem like a man who knows his way around." Pike looked up with bleary eyes, taking in Takoda's Comanche features and traditional dress. "Well, well. Don't get many of your kind in here. What brings you to Bitter Creek?" "Trade," Takoda said simply, settling into the chair across from Pike. "I deal in horses mostly, but I'm always interested in new opportunities." "Horses, eh?" Pike's eyes sharpened with interest. "That's good business in this territory. Lots of demand for quality mounts. Of course, there's other kinds of trade that pay even better if a man's got the stomach for it." "What kind of trade?" Pike glanced around the saloon again, then lowered his voice. "The kind that involves supplying certain merchandise to folks who pay premium prices. Beautiful merchandise, if you catch my meaning." From her position at the bar, Elliana felt her stomach clench with rage and revulsion. Pike was talking about human trafficking as casually as he might discuss trading cattle. "I'm not sure I understand," Takoda said carefully. "Smart man plays ignorant." Pike chuckled. "Can't blame you for being cautious. But let me tell you something. There's a fellow operates out of the Guadalupe Mountains who's always looking for quality suppliers. Name of Marcus Harrow. Ever hear of him?" Takoda shook his head, though his pulse quickened at finally hearing confirmation of Harrow's location. "Well, Marcus is what you might call a businessman with sophisticated tastes. He appreciates quality merchandise, especially the young and pretty kind. Pays well for good information about where such merchandise might be found." "Information. Names, locations, family situations. You'd be surprised how much a man can learn just by keeping his ears open in places like this." Pike gestured around the saloon. "Take that school teacher I mentioned earlier. Sweet little thing named Elliana Moore. Lived all alone, no family to speak of, trusted everyone she met. Made her the perfect target." The words hit Elliana like physical blows, but she forced herself to remain motionless at the bar. Pike was describing her like she'd been livestock evaluated for slaughter. "What happened to her?" Takoda asked, his voice carefully neutral. "What do you think happened?" Pike laughed nastily. "Marcus and his boys paid her a visit, explained her new situation to her real clear-like. Last I heard, she was getting broken in proper at the main camp. Should fetch a fine price once she's properly trained." Elliana's vision went red around the edges, and her hand moved instinctively toward her knife. Only years of teacher's discipline kept her from crossing the room and opening Pike's throat right there in front of everyone. "This Marcus Harrow," Takoda continued. "Where exactly does he operate from? Now that's the kind of question that could get a man in trouble." Pike said, suddenly more cautious. "Marcus don't take kindly to folks asking too many questions about his business." "Of course. I'm just wondering if it's anywhere near the routes I travel. Wouldn't want to accidentally interfere with his operations." Pike studied Takoda for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Finally, the whiskey won out over caution. "Tell you what, friend. You seem like a man who understands opportunity when he sees it. There's a trading post about 50 miles northeast of here called Devil's Fork. You ride there on the 1st of next month and ask for a man named Sullivan. Tell him Pike sent you, that you might have information worth sharing. If Sullivan likes what he hears, he might just introduce you to some very profitable people." "Sullivan at Devil's Fork," Takoda repeated. "1st of the month." That's right. But let me give you some advice. Indian Marcus Harrow ain't the forgiving type. You cross him or disappoint him, and you'll end up as entertainment for his boys. They got some creative ways of dealing with problems, if you know what I mean. I understand. Pike drained his glass and lurched to his feet. Well, I got business to attend to. Been real educational talking with you. As Pike staggered toward the stairs leading to the saloon's second floor, Takoda returned to the bar where Elliana waited. Her face was pale but composed, though he could see the storm of emotions raging behind her green eyes. "You heard?" he asked quietly. "Every word?" Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her whiskey glass. "Devil's Fork, 1st of the month. A man named Sullivan. That's still 2 weeks away. Gives us time to plan our approach." "No." Elliana set down her glass with careful precision. "We're not waiting 2 weeks. Elliana, that man upstairs just spent 20 minutes bragging about destroying my life and delivering me to hell. He's planning to do the same thing to other women, and we're going to let him continue for 2 more weeks." Takoda glanced around the saloon, noting how many people were within earshot. "We can't do anything here. Too many witnesses, too many complications. Then we follow him when he leaves. Tomorrow, tonight, whenever. But we're not letting him walk away to ruin more lives." The cold determination in her voice reminded Takoda of something his grandmother used to say about wounded wolves. They were twice as dangerous because they had nothing left to lose. "All right," he said finally. "We follow him, but we do it smart. No unnecessary risks, no letting emotion override judgment." "Agreed. But Takoda, yes. When we catch him alone, I want 5 minutes with him before we start asking questions. 5 minutes to explain exactly who I am and what he helped do to me." Looking into her eyes, Takoda saw something that made him glad they were on the same side. Elliana Moore had indeed been broken by her ordeal. But like a sword reforged in flame, she had emerged sharper and more dangerous than before. 5 minutes, he agreed. "But after that, we extract every piece of information he has about Harrow's operation." "Oh, he'll talk," Elliana said with quiet confidence. "After 5 minutes with me, Coleman Pike will tell us everything he knows and beg us to let him die quickly." The transformation was complete. The terrified victim who had begged not to have her dress removed was gone forever. In her place sat a woman who had learned to make fear into a weapon and who was about to teach her tormentors the true meaning of consequences. Outside, the desert wind howled through Bitter Creek's empty streets, carrying with it the promise of justice, long delayed, but not forgotten. Tomorrow the hunt would begin in earnest. Dawn had barely touched the horizon when Pike stumbled out of the desert rose, his boots unsteady on the wooden planks as he made his way toward the livery stable. Elliana and Takoda had spent the night taking turns watching the saloon from their room across the street, and now their patience was about to be rewarded. Pike was leaving town, and they would be right behind him. "He's moving toward the stables," Elliana whispered, peering through the gap in their curtains. "Looks like he's planning to ride out this morning." Takoda was already gathering their gear, his movements quick and efficient. "Good. Once he's clear of town, we'll have our chance." They had discussed the plan through the long hours of the night. Follow Pike at a distance, wait for him to camp or stop somewhere isolated, then take him alive for questioning. It was simple in concept. But Elliana knew that her biggest challenge would be controlling the rage that burned in her chest every time she thought about confronting the man who had helped orchestrate her nightmare. Within minutes, they were saddled and ready, watching from an alley as Pike led his horse out of the stable. The man looked hungover and miserable, which would work in their favor. A sick, tired opponent was easier to track and subdue. Pike mounted up and rode out of Bitter Creek, heading northeast, the same direction he'd mentioned Devil's Fork lay. Takoda and Elliana waited until he was well clear of the settlement before following, keeping enough distance that they wouldn't be spotted while maintaining visual contact. The chase led them through increasingly rugged country as the morning wore on. Pike seemed to know where he was going, following game trails and cattle paths that suggested he'd traveled this route before. The landscape gradually shifted from desert scrub to rocky hills dotted with juniper and oak, providing better cover for pursuit. "He's heading for that pass," Takoda observed as they paused on a ridge to rest their horses. Below them, Pike was a distant figure winding his way up a narrow canyon between two towering rock formations. "Perfect," Elliana said, studying the terrain. "Once he's through that pass, he'll be trapped if we move fast enough to block his retreat." They pushed their horses harder, taking a parallel route that would bring them to the far end of the pass before Pike emerged. Takoda's knowledge of the country proved invaluable as he guided them through gullies and around outcroppings that kept them hidden while they raced to get ahead of their quarry. The pass was perhaps a quarter-mile long, narrow enough that a single rider could hold it against several opponents. More importantly, it led to a box canyon that would prevent Pike from escaping once they cornered him. Takoda positioned himself at the mouth of the pass, while Elliana circled around to block the canyon's back exit. They didn't have long to wait. Within the hour, Pike appeared at the pass entrance, still looking worse for wear from his night of drinking. He rode into the narrow defile without suspicion, unaware that he was walking into a trap. Takoda let him get halfway through before spurring his horse forward, blocking the retreat while letting out a war cry that echoed off the canyon walls. Pike's horse reared in panic, and the man nearly fell from his saddle as he fought to control his mount. "What the hell?" Pike shouted, wheeling around to see Takoda bearing down on him with a tomahawk in his hand. "Who are you? What do you want?" "Justice," Takoda replied, his voice carrying clearly in the confined space. "And information." Pike fumbled for the pistol at his belt, but his hungover reflexes were too slow. Takoda's horse slammed into his mount's shoulder, sending both Pike and his gun tumbling to the rocky ground. Before Pike could recover, Elliana appeared at the far end of the pass, cutting off his only remaining escape route. "Remember me, Coleman?" She called out, her voice carrying a deadly calm that made Pike's blood run cold. The man squinted at her through the dust and confusion, taking in her sun-darkened skin and Comanche dress. For a moment, recognition didn't dawn. Then his eyes widened in shock and terror. "No," he breathed. "You're supposed to be. Harrow said you were dead." Elliana dismounted and began walking toward him, her hand resting on her knife hilt. "Broken, destroyed beyond repair. Sorry to disappoint you, Coleman, but I'm very much alive. And I've learned some new skills since we last met." Pike scrambled backward across the rocky ground, his face gone white with panic. "Look, I don't know what you think happened, but I never..." "You never what?" Elliana interrupted, still advancing with that same terrifying calm. "Never scouted Cedar Ridge, never asked questions about the unmarried schoolteacher who lived alone, never reported back to Marcus Harrow that I'd be an easy target. I was just gathering information. I never laid a hand on you. No, you just delivered me to the men who did." Elliana stopped about 10 feet away from him, close enough that he could see the cold fire in her green eyes. "You sold me like livestock, Coleman. Traded my life for whatever blood money Harrow paid you." Takoda had dismounted as well and was approaching from the other side, effectively boxing Pike in between them. "We want to know about Harrow's operation," he said. "Locations, numbers, how the network operates. Tell us everything, and your death will be quick." "Death?" Pike's voice cracked with terror. "Now wait just a minute. I can be useful to you folks. I know things, important things. We can make a deal." "The only deal," Elliana said, drawing her knife and letting the blade catch the morning light, "is that you get to choose how much pain you experience before you tell us what we want to know." Pike's eyes darted between them, looking for any sign of mercy or hesitation. He found none. These weren't the sort of people who could be reasoned with or bribed. They had come here for one purpose, and they wouldn't be deterred. All right, he said, raising his hands in surrender. I'll tell you whatever you want to know. Just don't let her near me with that knife. Start talking, Takoda ordered. How many men does Harrow have? Where is his main camp? The main compound is in a box canyon about 30 miles northeast of here in the Guadalupe foothills. He's got maybe 20 men there at any given time, plus however many girls they're training. Elliana's jaw tightened at the euphemism, but she kept her voice level. How many women are there now? I don't know exactly. Half a dozen, maybe more. They come and go depending on market demand. Market demand, Elliana repeated slowly. You mean depending on how quickly they're sold to brothels and private buyers? Pike nodded miserably, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Look, I know how it sounds, but it's just business. Supply and demand. There's always been a market for... The knife was at his throat before he could finish the sentence, Elliana having moved with a speed that caught both men by surprise. Pike found himself staring into eyes that held all the warmth of winter stars. If you call it just business, one more time, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. I'm going to start removing pieces of you very slowly. Those women have names, lives, families who miss them. They're not merchandise. I understand. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. Tell us about the compound's defenses, Takoda interrupted before Elliana could make good on her threat. Guards, weapons, entrances. Pike swallowed carefully, very aware of the steel pressed against his jugular. There's only one way in or out of the canyon where the compound sits. Harrow's got men posted at the entrance day and night. The buildings are arranged in a rough square around a central courtyard. The girls are kept in a stone building at the back, used to be a mission before Harrow took it over. How many guards at the entrance? Usually 4 during the day, 6 at night. But they're not expecting trouble. Harrow's got agreements with most of the local law, and the compound's location is supposed to be secret. What kind of agreements? Elliana asked, though she kept the knife in place. Money, mostly. Some of the girls as payment. Sheriff Caldwell in Eagle Pass gets a monthly envelope that keeps him looking the other way. Judge Morrison in San Antonio gets his pick of the new arrivals before they go to market. The casual way Pike described the corruption made Elliana's stomach turn with revulsion. The network of complicity was even more extensive than she'd imagined. Who else is involved? Traders, saloon owners, even some preachers. Anyone who can identify potential targets or help move merchandise without questions. It's a big operation, been running for years. And you, Takoda asked. What's your role in all this? I'm a scout, like I told you in the saloon. I travel around, identify suitable targets, report back to Harrow or his lieutenants. They decide which ones are worth pursuing. How do you communicate with them? Dead drops, mostly. There's a hollow tree about 5 miles from here where I leave reports. Someone checks it every few days. Elliana pressed the knife a little deeper, drawing a thin line of blood. Who's Harrow's second in command? Who runs things when he's not there? A man named Black Pete. Real name's Peter Garrison, but nobody calls him that to his face. He's mean as a snake and twice as deadly. Been with Harrow since the beginning. How many men does Harrow have working the territory? 15, maybe 20 scouts like me. Plus the guards at the compound and a few enforcers who handle problems. Maybe 40 men total. Takoda absorbed this information grimly. 40 men was a small army, far more than he and Elliana could handle in direct confrontation. They would need to be very clever about how they approached this. The mission building where the women are kept, Elliana said. Describe it. Stone walls, heavy wooden doors, barred windows. Used to have a bell tower, but Harrow had it torn down. There's usually 2 guards outside, more if they've got new arrivals who haven't been broken in yet. Keys. Harrow keeps the main set. Black Pete has a spare. The guards just have keys to the outer doors. Elliana stepped back slightly, though she kept the knife ready. What's the schedule? When do they move women out? When do new ones arrive? No set schedule. Depends on orders from buyers. Sometimes they'll ship out 3 or 4 girls in a week, sometimes none for a month. New ones come in whenever the scouts find good targets. Speaking of good targets, Takoda said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Tell us about your next assignment. Who were you planning to scout after you left Bitter Creek? Pike's eyes darted nervously between them. I wasn't sure yet. Still gathering information. The lie was obvious, and Elliana's patience was wearing thin. Coleman, I'm going to count to 3. If you haven't told us the truth by then, I'm going to start cutting off fingers. 1. All right, there's a girl in Devil's Fork works at the general store. Name's Rebecca Walsh. 19 pretty lives with her elderly aunt. I was supposed to gather more information about her situation. Supposed to, Harrow's interested in her. Wants to know if she'd be a good acquisition. The cold, clinical way he discussed destroying another young woman's life made Takoda want to bury his tomahawk in Pike's skull. But they still needed more information. How do we get into the compound? He asked. You don't, Pike said flatly. Not without an army. The place is a fortress, and Harrow's too paranoid to let strangers get close. There has to be a way. Supply deliveries meetings with buyers, something. Pike was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he spoke again. There's a livestock trader named Murphy who brings in supplies every few weeks. Harrow trusts him because they've done business for years. But Murphy's got to be vouched for by someone Harrow knows. Like you. I could arrange an introduction, tell Harrow that Murphy found a new partner who might be useful to the operation. But you'd have to play it very careful. One wrong word and you'd both end up dead. Elliana looked at Takoda, seeing the same thought in his eyes. It was dangerous, but it might be their only chance to get inside the compound. How long before your next scheduled contact with Harrow? Takoda asked. I'm supposed to check the dead drop tomorrow, leave a report about Bitter Creek. Perfect. You're going to write a very specific report telling Harrow about a livestock trader and his Comanche partner who might be valuable additions to the operation. And if I refuse? Elliana smiled, and it was one of the most terrifying expressions Pike had ever seen. Then I get to spend some quality time with you demonstrating exactly what your friends did to me in that compound. Except I won't be nearly as gentle as they were. Pike's face went ashen. I'll write the report. Whatever you want me to say. Good choice. Takoda pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil from his saddlebags. Start writing. And Coleman, if you try to warn Harrow in any way, I'll let her have you for as long as she wants. Pike's hands shook as he took the writing materials, but he began composing the report as instructed. As he wrote, Elliana found herself studying his face, remembering how he'd smiled and joked with the townspeople in Cedar Ridge while gathering information to destroy her life. The banality of evil, she thought. Men like Pike committed atrocities not out of passion or madness, but simply because it was profitable. There, Pike said, handing back the paper. I've described you as Jake Murphy's new partner, a half-breed with connections to hostile tribes who might be useful for expanding operations into Comanche territory. Takoda read the report carefully, checking for any hidden warnings or coded messages. Finding none, he folded it and tucked it into his shirt. Now what? Pike asked hopefully. You got what you wanted, right? Information about the compound, a way to get inside. We're square now. Elliana and Takoda exchanged a look that made Pike's blood run cold. Coleman, Elliana said softly, do you remember what I said about giving you 5 minutes to explain exactly who I am and what you helped do to me? Now wait a minute. Those 5 minutes start now. What followed was the longest 5 minutes of Coleman Pike's life. Elliana described in clinical detail what Marcus Harrow and his men had done to her during those 3 weeks of captivity. She told him about the chains, the beatings, the systematic destruction of her dignity and self-worth. She made him understand that his harmless information gathering had led directly to her torture and the torture of countless other women. By the time she finished, Pike was sobbing like a child, his face streaked with tears and snot. I didn't know, he kept repeating. I just gathered information. I never thought about what happened after. That's the problem, Elliana said coldly. You never thought about us as real people. We were just potential profit to you. Takoda stepped forward, his tomahawk in his hand. Any last words, Coleman? Pike looked up at them with desperate eyes. Please. I have information you can use. I know things about other operations, other networks. I can help you save more women. You can save us the time of hunting you down later, Elliana replied. That's help enough. The blade went in clean, just as Takoda had taught her. A quick thrust beneath the ribs angled upward toward the heart. Pike's eyes went wide with shock, then gradually dimmed as his life ebbed away. Elliana stood over his body for a long moment, feeling empty. She had expected satisfaction, a sense of closure, or justice served. Instead, she felt only the hollow knowledge that Coleman Pike would never hurt another woman and that his death brought her no peace. How do you feel? Takoda asked gently. Like killing him was necessary but not enough, she replied honestly. He was just one small part of a much larger evil. Then we continue. We use his report to get into Harrow's compound, and we end this. They buried Pike's body under a cairn of stones, then rode to the dead drop location he'd described. Elliana placed the forged report in the hollow tree, then they found a hidden position where they could watch for whoever came to collect it. They didn't have to wait long. Near sunset, a grizzled man in buckskins approached the tree, collected the report, and rode off toward the northeast. Takoda and Elliana followed at a distance, marking the route that would lead them to Harrow's stronghold. The trail led through increasingly rough country as darkness fell. The man they were following knew the terrain well, taking shortcuts and hidden paths that would have been impossible to find without a guide. Eventually, they crested a ridge and saw their destination spread out below them. The compound sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by high cliff walls, exactly as Pike had described. Even in the darkness, they could make out the arrangement of buildings around a central courtyard. Lights flickered in several windows, and the glow of a large fire suggested that the evening meal was being prepared. There, Takoda whispered, pointing to the stone building at the back of the compound. That has to be where they're keeping the women. Elliana stared at the mission building, knowing that somewhere behind those barred windows were women enduring the same hell she had survived. The knowledge burned in her chest like acid. How many guards do you count? She asked. Takoda studied the compound carefully. 4 at the main gate, 2 walking patrol routes, maybe more inside the buildings. Pike wasn't lying about it being well defended. But not impossible. No, not impossible. But we'll need to be very careful about timing and approach. They spent the next hour studying the compound's layout and guard routines, noting weak points and escape routes. As the night wore on, most of the lights went out, leaving only the guard posts illuminated. Tomorrow we go in as Murphy's partner, Takoda said as they prepared to withdraw to a safe distance for the night. Once we're inside, we find a way to free the women and deal with Harrow. And if our cover is blown, Then we fight our way out and pray we can take enough of them with us to make a difference. As they rode away from the ridge, Elliana found herself thinking about the women in that stone building. Were they lying awake right now, wondering if rescue would ever come? Did they still have hope, or had it been beaten out of them as it nearly had been beaten out of her? "They're going to be terrified of us at first," she said suddenly. "Who?" "The women we're going to free. They've been broken, terrorized, taught to fear everyone and everything. When we break down those doors, they're going to think we're just more captors." Takoda considered this. "What do you suggest?" "I go in first, alone. Let them see that I'm a woman, that I understand what they've been through. Give them hope before we ask them to trust us with their lives." "That's dangerous. If something goes wrong, at least they'll know that someone tried. That someone cared enough to risk everything for them." They made camp in a hidden canyon several miles from the compound, taking turns standing watch while the other tried to rest. But sleep didn't come easily for either of them. Tomorrow they would walk into the heart of Marcus Harrow's operation, and the odds of walking back out alive were not encouraging. As dawn approached, Elliana found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a schoolteacher living a quiet, orderly life. Then men like Harrow and Pike had torn that life apart, reducing her to a broken thing, begging not to be touched. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that breaking someone meant destroying them completely. They had not understood that some people, when shattered, reformed themselves into something harder and more dangerous than they had ever been before. Today, Marcus Harrow and his men would learn the true cost of their cruelty. Today the prey would become the hunter, and justice long delayed would finally be served. The sun rose over the desert, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. It was going. The livestock trader Murphy proved to be exactly what Pike had described, a weathered man in his 50s who asked few questions and cared only about profit. When Takoda approached him at his ranch with Pike's letter of introduction, Murphy barely glanced at the credentials before agreeing to vouch for his new partner at Harrow's compound. "You bring your own wagon and supplies," Murphy told them as they finalized the arrangement. "I don't ask questions about your business, you don't ask about mine. We deliver the goods, collect our payment, and part ways. Simple as that." Simple, perhaps, but Elliana's heart hammered against her ribs as their small convoy approached the compound's entrance 3 days later. She rode beside Takoda on the driver's seat of their supply wagon, her Comanche disguise complete down to the traditional dress and braided hair. Beneath the fabric, her knife waited at her belt alongside a small pistol Takoda had procured for her. The guards at the gate were exactly what she'd expected, hard-faced men with cold eyes who looked at her with the same calculating gaze she remembered from her captors. One of them, a tall man with graying hair and a permanent scowl, stepped forward to inspect their wagons. "Murphy," he said with a curt nod. "Harrow's expecting you." "Who's your friend?" "Jake Wilson," Takoda replied in the slightly accented English he'd perfected for his cover identity. "Murphy's told me good things about your operation here." "Has he now?" The guard's eyes lingered on Elliana with obvious interest. "Pretty woman you got there, Wilson. She for trade?" Elliana felt her jaw clench with familiar rage, but she kept her eyes downcast as a submissive Comanche wife would. Takoda's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his weapon. "She's mine," he said with quiet menace. "And she stays that way." The guard chuckled but stepped back. "Fair enough. Follow the main path to the courtyard. Harrow's in the big house on the north side. And Wilson, keep your woman close. Some of the boys here get ideas when they see fresh meat." As their wagon rolled through the compound's gates, Elliana got her first clear look at the place that had haunted her nightmares. The buildings were arranged exactly as Pike had described, weathered adobe and stone structures surrounding a central courtyard, where several men lounged in the afternoon sun. At the back of the compound, the old mission building rose like a monument to perverted purpose, its barred windows reflecting the desert sunlight. "There," she whispered to Takoda, barely moving her lips. "The stone building. That's where they are." Takoda followed her gaze and nodded slightly. Even from this distance, they could see guards posted at the building's entrance. Two men with rifles, looking bored but alert. Their wagon creaked to a halt in front of the main house, a sprawling structure that had clearly been expanded several times over the years. The door opened before they could dismount, and Marcus Harrow stepped onto the porch. Elliana's blood turned to ice water. 6 months of nightmares hadn't prepared her for the reality of seeing him again. Harrow was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, with dark hair going gray at the temples and pale eyes that missed nothing. He looked prosperous and well-fed, a man comfortable with his power and position. "Murphy, you old devil," Harrow called out with false joviality. "Good to see you again. And this must be the partner Pike mentioned in his report." "Jake Wilson," Takoda said, climbing down from the wagon. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Harrow. Call me Marcus. Any friend of Murphy's is welcome here." Harrow's gaze shifted to Elliana, who remained seated on the wagon as instructed. "And who's this lovely creature?" "My woman," Takoda replied. "She doesn't speak much English." "Pity. I do enjoy conversation with a beautiful woman." Harrow's smile was predatory, and Elliana had to fight every instinct to avoid reaching for her knife. "Well, come inside. Let's discuss business over some decent whiskey." The interior of Harrow's house was surprisingly elegant for a frontier compound. Rich carpets covered polished floors, and oil paintings in gilt frames decorated the walls. It was the home of a man who had profited greatly from human misery. "Impressive operation you have here," Takoda said as Harrow poured drinks from a crystal decanter. 20 years in the making," Harrow replied with obvious pride. "Started with nothing but a good eye for opportunity and the will to take risks. Now I've got the finest operation between El Paso and San Antonio. Pike mentioned you might be interested in expanding into Comanche territory." "Very interested. The Indian trade has always been tricky. Too much risk of tribal retaliation. But with the right partner, someone who understands the culture and can identify suitable targets." Harrow let the implication hang in the air. Elliana forced herself to remain still and silent as the two men discussed expanding the slave trade into her adoptive people's lands. Every word was another reason why Harrow needed to die, but she had to wait for the right moment. "What kind of volume are we talking about?" Takoda asked. "Depends on demand. Right now I move maybe 30-40 girls a year through here. Good ones bring premium prices, $500, sometimes $1,000 each, from the right buyers." Harrow's tone was casual, as if he were discussing livestock. "With access to Comanche territory, we could double those numbers easily. And the local authorities?" Harrow laughed. "What authorities? I own half the judges in this territory, and the other half are too scared to cross me. The Rangers avoid this area like it's cursed, and the Army's got better things to do than chase down missing Indian girls." "Smart business," Takoda said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Two profitable partnerships." As the men drank, Elliana caught sight of movement through the window. A woman in a torn dress was being escorted across the courtyard by 2 guards, her wrists bound and her face blank with despair. The sight hit Elliana like a physical blow, reminding her of her own journey to hell in this very place. "Excuse me," she said suddenly, speaking in broken English with a heavy accent. "Need use place for women." Harrow looked surprised to hear her speak, but nodded toward a door at the back of the room. Through there and outside. Don't wander off, some of my boys might get the wrong idea. Elliana stood carefully playing the role of a woman uncomfortable in civilized surroundings. As she moved toward the indicated door, she caught Takoda's eye and saw his almost imperceptible nod. This was their chance to gather intelligence and position themselves for what was to come. The back door led to a small garden area behind the main house. From here, Elliana had a clear view of the mission building where the captive women were held. She could see guards at the front entrance, but the building's rear wall appeared unguarded. More importantly, she could see that several of the barred windows on the ground floor had been left partially open to provide ventilation. Moving carefully to avoid attracting attention, she made her way closer to the mission building. As she approached the rear wall, she heard something that made her heart break, the sound of women's voices, low and frightened, coming from within. "Think they'll sell us soon," one voice was saying. "Don't matter," came the reply. "Ain't nowhere worse than here. Sarah's been here 3 months. She says some of the buyers are worse than Harrow's men." "Can't be worse. Nothing could be worse." Elliana pressed herself against the wall beneath one of the windows, tears streaming down her face as she listened to conversations that could have been her own just months before. These women had given up hope, accepted that their lives were over. They needed to know that rescue was possible. "Listen to me," she whispered urgently in English, her voice barely audible. "Can you hear me?" The conversation inside stopped abruptly. "Who's there?" one of the women asked fearfully. "My name is Elliana. I was like you, once trapped in this place, broken by these men. But I escaped, and I've come back for you." "You're lying," another voice said. "Nobody escapes from here." "I'm not lying. Tonight when the moon sets, be ready. We're going to get you out of here. They'll kill us if we try to run. They'll kill you anyway, eventually. Or sell you to someone who will. This is your chance to fight back." There was a long silence from within the building. Finally, one of the women spoke again. "How many of you are there?" "2. But we know what we're doing." 2 people against Harrow's whole gang. That's suicide." "Maybe," Elliana admitted. "But I'd rather die fighting than live as a slave. Wouldn't you?" Before any of the women could answer, footsteps approached from around the corner of the building. Elliana quickly moved away from the window, returning to her role as Takoda's woman seeking privacy for natural needs. The guard who appeared was young, maybe 20, with the kind of face that might have been handsome before cruelty hardened it. He looked Elliana up and down with obvious interest. "Well, well," he said with a leering grin. "What have we here?" "You're even prettier up close, sweetheart." Elliana kept her eyes downcast, playing the part of a frightened Indian woman. "No speak English good," she said in a heavy accent. "Looking for, how you say, place for women business." "Women business, eh?" The guard stepped closer, his hand moving to her arm. "Maybe I can help you with that business." The moment his fingers touched her skin, Elliana's training took over. Her knife was in her hand and at his throat before he could react, her other hand clamping over his mouth to muffle any cry. "Listen very carefully," she whispered in perfect English, her accent completely gone. "I'm going to ask you some questions, and you're going to answer them quietly. If you try to call for help or struggle, I'll open your throat. Do you understand?" The guard's eyes went wide with terror, but he nodded. "Good. How many women are in that building?" 7, he whispered when she moved her hand slightly from his mouth. "How many guards on the night shift?" 4. 2 here, 2 at the front gate. What time do the guards change? Midnight. Elliana absorbed this information quickly. 7 women to evacuate, minimal guards during the night shift. It was more manageable than she'd hoped. "One more question," she said. "Do you remember a woman named Elliana Moore Brown, hair, green eyes, about my height?" The guard's face went pale as recognition dawned. You're supposed to be. Dead broken? Yes, I know. Surprise. Her knife pressed a little deeper, drawing a thin line of blood. I want you to deliver a message to Marcus Harrow. Tell him that Elliana Moore sends her regards and that she'll be seeing him very soon. Before the guard could respond, Elliana brought the pommel of her knife down hard on his temple. He collapsed unconscious at her feet. She quickly dragged his body behind a pile of lumber where it wouldn't be immediately discovered, then made her way back to the main house. Takoda and Harrow were still drinking and discussing business when she returned, though she could see tension in Takoda's shoulders that suggested the conversation was becoming more difficult to maintain. "Ah, there you are," Harrow said as she entered. "I was just telling your man here about some of the challenges of our business. Keeping the merchandise in line, dealing with troublesome clients, that sort of thing." "Challenges are part of any business," Takoda replied carefully. "True enough. But some challenges are more personal than others." Harrow's eyes had taken on a calculating look that made Elliana's skin crawl. "For instance, I had a girl here a few months back who caused considerable trouble. Thought she was too good for her situation, kept trying to escape, fighting back. Very disruptive to the other merchandise." Elliana felt her blood run cold, but she kept her expression neutral. "What happened to her?" Takoda asked. "Oh, we broke her spirit eventually. Had to be more creative than usual, but we got there in the end. Then we sold her to a buyer in Mexico who specializes in difficult cases." Harrow's smile was cruel. "I heard she didn't last long after that. Shame, really. She was quite beautiful." The lie hit Elliana like a physical blow. Harrow thought she was dead, which meant he had no idea who was sitting in his parlor. But the casual way he discussed her, supposed fate, the obvious pleasure he took in describing her suffering, ignited a rage that threatened to burn away all her careful planning. "Sounds like you handled it well," Takoda said, his voice steady, despite the fury Elliana could see building behind his eyes. "Experience, my friend. 20 years of dealing with rebellious women teaches a man how to break them properly. It's all about understanding what they value most, then taking it away piece by piece until they have nothing left but obedience." Elliana's hand moved instinctively toward her knife, but Takoda caught her eye and shook his head almost imperceptibly. Not yet. They needed to maintain their cover until the right moment. "Well," Takoda said, standing up, "this has been most educational. Perhaps we should discuss specific arrangements for future business." "Of course, but first, let me show you around the operation. I'm proud of what I've built here." Harrow rose as well, swaying slightly from the whiskey. "You'll want to see the quality of our current inventory before committing to a partnership." The tour that followed was a journey through hell. Harrow led them through various buildings, describing his operation with the pride of a successful businessman showing off his factory. He pointed out the workshops where captive women were forced to sew clothing for sale in town, the kitchens where they prepared meals for their captors, and finally, inevitably, the mission building where the newest arrivals were trained for their future roles. "This is where we keep the fresh merchandise," Harrow explained as they approached the stone building. "Takes time to break them in properly, teach them their place. Some learn faster than others." The guards at the front entrance nodded respectfully to Harrow as he produced a large iron key. "Evening, boss. Any problems today?" "Nothing unusual. Though I did hear one of the new girls has been asking questions about escape again. Might need some additional correction." "Want me to handle it?" "No, I'll deal with it personally later. First, I want to show my guests what quality merchandise looks like." The heavy wooden door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo from the depths of hell itself. The interior was dimly lit by oil lamps, revealing a corridor lined with heavy doors. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and despair. "We keep them separated initially," Harrow explained as they walked down the corridor. "Prevents them from organizing planning escapes together. Once they're properly broken, they can be housed communally." Through the small windows in each door, Elliana caught glimpses of the women inside, young faces marked by suffering eyes that had lost all hope. These were someone's daughters, sisters, sweethearts, reduced to inventory in Marcus Harrow's twisted accounting. "This one's new," Harrow said, stopping at a cell near the end of the corridor. "Rebecca Walsh from Devil's Fork. Pretty little thing, isn't she?" Through the window, Elliana saw a girl who couldn't be more than 19, huddled in the corner of her cell with her arms wrapped around her knees. Her dress was torn, her hair matted, and her eyes held the same hollow expression Elliana remembered from her own time in captivity. "She was the scout target Pike mentioned," Takoda observed. "That's right. Pike's reports are always accurate. Girl was exactly what he described, young, pretty, isolated. Perfect merchandise." Harrow's voice carried obvious satisfaction. "We acquired her 3 days ago. Should be ready for market within the month." Elliana found herself staring at Rebecca Walsh and seeing her own younger self. This girl had probably been a shop clerk or farmer's daughter just days ago, living a normal life with dreams and plans for the future. Now she was trapped in hell, and men like Harrow discussed her fate as casually as they might debate the price of cattle. "Impressive operation," Takoda said, though his voice sounded strained to Elliana's ears. "Very thorough. Has to be. One mistake, one moment of softness, and the whole system breaks down. These women need to understand that resistance is pointless, that their old lives are over completely. Only then can they accept their new purpose." As they reached the end of the corridor, Harrow turned toward a heavy door marked with iron studs. "And this is where we keep the real troublemakers. The ones who refuse to accept reality." The door opened to reveal a larger cell containing 5 women in various stages of deterioration. Some sat listlessly against the walls, their spirits clearly broken. Others showed signs of more recent defiance, bruises, cuts, and the kind of hollow-eyed determination that came from refusing to surrender despite impossible odds. "This is where that Moore girl spent her last few weeks with us," Harrow said conversationally. "Stubborn as a mule, that one. Kept insisting she was going to escape, going to bring justice down on us. Quite amusing, really." One of the women in the cell looked up at the sound of the name, her eyes focusing on Elliana with sudden intensity. She was older than the others, maybe 30, with graying brown hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard living even before her captivity. "Did you say Moore?" the woman asked, her voice hoarse, but carrying a note of desperate hope. Harrow frowned at the interruption. "Quiet you. Nobody gave you permission to speak." But the woman ignored him, continuing to stare at Elliana. "Elliana Moore. About your height, green eyes, used to be a teacher." Elliana's heart stopped. This woman had known her, had been here during her captivity. Before she could think of how to respond, the woman spoke again. "She talked about you," the woman said, still looking at Elliana. "Said she had a friend, someone who would come looking for her. Someone who wouldn't give up." The deception was unraveling, but Elliana realized it didn't matter anymore. They were here, they had the information they needed, and these women deserved to know that help had finally arrived. "She was right," Elliana said quietly, dropping her accent entirely. "I never gave up." Harrow's head snapped toward her, his face going white as understanding dawned. "You? But that's impossible. You're dead. I sold you to—" "You sold nobody," Elliana said, her hand moving to her knife. "You dumped me behind a trader's wagon and left me to die. But I didn't die, Marcus. I healed. I learned. And I came back." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrow's mouth worked soundlessly as he tried to process what he was hearing. The women in the cell pressed against the bars, hope beginning to flicker in their eyes for the first time in months. "Guards!" Harrow finally managed to shout. "Guards!" But his cry was cut off as Takoda's tomahawk buried itself in his chest. The slave trader staggered backward, looking down at the weapon protruding from his ribs with surprise and confusion. "That's for Elliana," Takoda said grimly, "and for every woman you've destroyed." Harrow collapsed to his knees, blood spreading across his shirt. He looked up at Elliana with dying eyes full of rage and disbelief. You were nothing," he gasped. "Just another broken whore." "I was a teacher," Elliana said, kneeling beside him, so he could see her clearly. "My name is Elliana Moore, and I am the last face you'll ever see." The knife went in quick and clean, ending Marcus Harrow's reign of terror with surgical precision. As his body toppled forward, Elliana felt a weight she'd carried for months finally lift from her shoulders. "The keys," Takoda said urgently, already searching Harrow's body. "We need to get them out of here before—" Heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor as guards responded to Harrow's final cry. Takoda tossed the ring of keys to Elliana and drew his pistol, positioning himself to cover the doorway. "Free them," he ordered. "All of them. I'll hold off the guards as long as I can." Elliana's fingers flew over the keys, trying each one in the locks of the communal cell. Behind her, she could hear Takoda's gun begin to bark as the first guards appeared in the corridor. "Come on," she urged the women as the cell door finally swung open. "We're getting you out of here." But the women hesitated, too broken and afraid to believe that escape was really possible. "Listen to me," Elliana said urgently. "I know you're scared. I know you think this is just another trick, another way to hurt you. But I swear on everything I hold dear, we're here to save you. This is real." The older woman, who had recognized her name, stepped forward first. "If you're really Elliana Moore, then you know what we've been through. You know what it's like." "I know," Elliana said simply, "and I know it feels impossible to hope again. But sometimes impossible things happen. Sometimes the broken things put themselves back together and come for the people who broke them." One by one, the women began to emerge from their cell. Some moved tentatively, as if afraid the floor might give way beneath them. Others stumbled as their legs, weakened by captivity, struggled to support them. "The other cells," the older woman said. "There are more girls locked up alone." Elliana began working her way down the corridor, freeing women from individual cells, while Takoda continued his desperate defense of the doorway. The sound of gunfire was growing more intense as more guards arrived. "Elliana," Takoda called out. "We need to move. They're bringing up reinforcements." By now, she had freed all 7 women from their cells, but they were a pathetic group, weakened, traumatized, and in no condition for a running battle. Getting them out of the compound alive would require a miracle. "Is there another way out of this building?" Elliana asked the older woman. "There's a door at the back, but it's always locked." "Not anymore." Elliana led the group of freed women toward the rear of the building, while Takoda fought a running retreat down the corridor. His ammunition wouldn't last much longer. The back door yielded to one of Harrow's keys, opening onto the small yard behind the mission building. From here, they could see the compound's rear wall and the narrow canyon beyond. It was their only chance. "Can you climb?" Elliana asked the women, indicating the rocky wall that surrounded the compound. "We'll have to," the older woman replied grimly. "It's climb or die." Takoda appeared in the doorway behind them, his face grim. "They've backed off for the moment, but they'll be coming with everything they have. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they organize a proper assault. Then we better move fast." Elliana looked at the group of women, seeing fear and desperation, but also a growing spark of determination. Stay together, help each other, and don't look back. Once we're over that wall, we run for the canyon mouth and don't stop until we're clear. The climb was harrowing. The women were weak, their hands soft from captivity, and the rock face was treacherous in the darkness. But desperation gave them strength, and one by one, they hauled themselves up the wall and over the top. Elliana went last, providing a boost for the others, while Takoda covered their escape from below. As she reached the top of the wall, she looked back at the compound that had been the site of so much suffering. Lights were moving frantically between the buildings as guards searched for their escaped prisoners. "Come on," Takoda called from below. "Time to go." They dropped down the far side of the wall and began running for the canyon mouth, the freed women stumbling and gasping, but somehow keeping pace. Behind them, shouts of alarm echoed from the compound as their escape was discovered. By the time they reached the canyon entrance, pursuit was already beginning. Torches bobbed in the darkness as mounted men poured out of the compound, their angry voices carrying clearly in the night air. "This way," Takoda said, leading them up a narrow trail that climbed the canyon wall. "There's a hidden path that leads to the mesa top. Once we're up there, they'll never find us in the dark." The climb was brutal, especially for women weakened by months of captivity and abuse. But they pushed themselves beyond their limits, driven by the knowledge that capture meant death or something worse. One step at a time, they hauled themselves up the treacherous trail toward freedom. When they finally reached the mesa top, the compound below looked like a disturbed anthill, tiny figures running back and forth in confused patterns. The pursuit had lost their trail in the darkness, at least for now. "We did it," one of the younger women whispered, collapsing to her knees in exhaustion. "We actually did it." "It's not over yet," Elliana warned. "They'll keep looking for us. We need to keep moving until we're well clear of their territory." But as the adrenaline of escape began to fade, she found herself looking at the women she'd helped free and feeling something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope. These women would heal as she had healed. They would rebuild their lives as she was rebuilding hers. The cycle of victimization that had seemed unbreakable was finally broken. "What happens now?" the older woman asked. "Now we get you somewhere safe," Elliana replied. "There are towns where Harrow's corruption didn't reach good people who will help you get back to your families or start new lives if that's what you choose." And then Elliana looked back at the compound where torches still searched frantically for their trail. "Then we make sure this never happens again. Harrow's dead, but his network is still out there. Other operations, other slaves, other victims, waiting for someone to care enough to fight for them." "You're going after them." "We're going after them," she corrected, including Takoda in her gaze. "All of them. Until every compound is ash and every slaver is dead." As they began the long journey towards safety, Elliana found herself thinking about the teacher she had been just months ago. That woman, naive, trusting, believing in the fundamental goodness of humanity, was gone forever. In her place stood someone harder, more dangerous, but also more complete. The scars on her body had faded, but the ones on her soul would never disappear entirely. That was acceptable. They served as reminders of what she had survived, what she had overcome, and what she was now capable of fighting for. Behind them, the lights of Harrow's compound grew smaller and smaller, until they were just another star in the vast desert night. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the promise of more battles to come. But for the first time since her ordeal began, Elliana Moore felt truly free. The broken prey had become the hunter. The victim had become the warrior. And the teacher had become something the world desperately needed: someone willing to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. In the distance, dawn was beginning to touch the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was going to be a beautiful day to start over.